You're live.
Great, Paul. Thanks. Okay, I think we can get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another webinar organized by the International Manifesto Group. Last Wednesday marked the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Saigon, and we decided that it would be very remiss of us not to have an event on it. So actually, let me just start again because we've just started recording. So hello and welcome to another webinar organized by the International Manifesto Group. Last Wednesday marked the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Saigon. And we thought that it would be very remiss of us not to have an event marking this. So we put together a little bit hurriedly, but anyway, here goes. And I think what we want to do today is we want to reflect on what we can learn from that historic victory. I'm Radhika Desai, convener of the International Manifesto Group, and I will be moderating this event. It ought to surprise no one that the 30th of April 1975 liberation of Saigon remade the world. Unfortunately, however, it surprises all too many. The deep historical truth of the US's traumatic defeat in the Vietnam War is, not surprisingly, repressed in dominant Western discourse. Of course, inevitably, like Banquo's ghost at Macbeth's banquet, these repressed truths return, leaving the US constantly tormented by it. On the one hand, the full extent of the atrocity, as well as the futility of the US effort in Vietnam, is not admitted. Even very progressive US intellectuals, such as those of the worthy Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, which has argued for a long time for a less militaristic US foreign policy, can't quite concede it. Its founding director, Andrew Bacevich, is a long-standing opponent of the neoconservative policies that have driven US militarism in this century. Yet he states that, and I'm quoting him now, American foreign policy elites have spent the last 50 years engaged in a concerted effort to evade their responsibility for the Vietnam disaster. And that, again I'm quoting, yesterday's mistakes become the basis for tomorrow's actions, end of quote. However, the Vietnam War was no mere mistake or even disaster. These words connote aberrations, whereas the US's murderous, even genocidal military campaign in Vietnam was, as critical historians of US foreign policy going back to the days of Charles and Mary Beard and William Appleman Williams point out, is the latest venture in a series that connects back to the formative expansionist impulses of the United States, impulses that were recharged in the 20th century when US ruling elites acquired their lust to replace Britain as imperialist in chief. On the other hand, Vietnam has haunted the Pentagon ever since its historic defeat 50 years ago. Ever since then, in Iraq or Libya, Ukraine or Afghanistan, Somalia or Yugoslavia, every one of these wars has become an effort to overcome the Vietnam syndrome. First named by Ronald Reagan, it denoted the aura of shame and guilt, of incompetence and unworthiness that has hung over US military ventures ever since. Reagan proposed to dispel it rhetorically and practically. Rhetorically, he blamed the Vietnam War on the North and declared that the US cause was a noble one, involving, in his words, a small country newly free from colonial rule, which the United States had to help in establishing self-rule and the means of self-defense against a totalitarian neighbor bent on conquest. Practically, he sought to dispel the Vietnam syndrome by invading, wait for it, tiny Grenada. After the invasion, he declared that, quote, our days of weakness are over. Our military forces are back on their feet and standing tall, end of quote. A few years later, President George H.W. Bush would end his own Gulf War by stating, again I'm quoting, the ghosts of Vietnam have been laid to rest beneath the sands of the Arabian desert, unquote. Clearly, this is a ghost that cannot sleep and refuses to lie down. Just as the Chinese poet Zhang Zhao observed, it is a phantom that feels a deep sense of loathing for its own being. The US was bound to be afflicted by this psychopathology of imperial decline. The single most important historical fact about US foreign policy since the early 20th century is that it had the misfortune to receive the mantle of lead imperialist just when the fierce energy of the world struggle for colonial liberation was beginning the long process of sending imperialism into decline. As this process has intensified and accelerated, imperial delusion has been progressively allayed only by doses of reality administered by anti-imperialist forces. The Vietnamese victory of April 1975 was arguably the single biggest dose. Decolonization had begun decades before, when the Second World War and the 30 Years crisis of capitalism and imperialism, which so diminished the powers of both, ended. However, the imperial countries could not accept this new reality. Whether it was the British in Malaya or Kenya, or the French in Algeria and Vietnam, European imperialist powers fought, often with US support, to hold on to what was left of their empires. One by one, however, they failed. Perhaps because in the Vietnamese case, the resistance to imperialism took a communist form, the strongest form there is. Or perhaps because the US imagined that its victory against Vietnam would mark the turning of the anti-imperialist tide, the US stepped in to this war with all its might. That this small nation, impoverished by nearly a century of colonial rule, followed by decades of exhausting war for national liberation against the French, could fight for more than another decade against the most powerful military on earth, and which was also able and willing to do its worst, and win so decisively, represented a historic reversal for imperialism. No wonder it was followed by a wave of revolutions in Iran, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Nicaragua, Grenada, and by intense revolutionary struggles more generally. No wonder it contributed to the stagflationary crisis of capitalism that so weakened the imperialist camp. No wonder also that the anti-war movement in the United States linked up with the struggle of African Americans and other oppressed communities, prompting a deep crisis of capitalist and imperialist legitimacy, and leading to a social, political, and cultural polarization that remains a feature of US society to this day. Put simply, the Vietnamese victory formed the hinge between the phase when decolonization was still being resisted by the imperial powers and that in which they had to deal with independent states. Subordinating them was now much harder and often failed despite Herculean imperialist efforts, accelerating the advance towards multipolarity, or, as Chavez would have put it, pluripolarity, and bringing the world, as we say in our manifesto, closer to socialism. So, with these remarks, I would like to end my sort of framing of our event today and go to the wonderful lineup of contributors that we have. I'd like to say, of course, that one thing I should like to clarify is that Luna Nguyen was not able to come. She has fallen ill and has lost her voice, so there is no way she could have participated. So we will have 4 speakers. I will introduce them as I go. One by one as they speak, and at the end of the speeches we'll have time for questions and answers. I should also like to record, by the way, that these introductory remarks, in putting together these introductory remarks, I had wonderful help from Carlos Martinez, Keith Bennett, and Alan Freeman. So thanks to all of them. So, okay, with all of that, here goes. Our first speaker will be Ken Hammond. Ken is professor of East Asian history and also, of course, a Vietnam War protester. So, Ken, please go ahead. Can you mute yourself? Hang on. Let me just, there you go. Okay,
there we go.
You can unmute yourself now.
There
yes,
we go.
Very good.
Okay.
Yes.
I wasn't sure if I was supposed to do that or you were supposed to do that. Yeah. Well, thank you, Radhika. It's of course great to be here. This is I appreciate you and the International Manifesto Group putting this together, especially in a rather hurried way. I am actually at the moment in Kent, Ohio, where we are commemorating the events of May 1970. And it is a situation where it makes me think not only, of course, of the celebration, the wonderful victory of the people of Vietnam at the liberation of Saigon, April 30th, 1975, but also 5 years before that, when on April 30th, President Nixon announced the invasion of Cambodia, clearly indicating that American imperialism, far from the much touted secret plan for peace that he said he had, was actually intent simply on continuing its neo-colonial war and expanding it indeed at that time. That triggered massive demonstrations here in Kent, Ohio, a university town in the Midwest, that culminated 55 years ago today in the shooting by the Ohio National Guard of 13 students, 4 of whom were killed, 9 wounded, and the suppression, the demonstration by the American state that it was willing to use lethal force against pretty much anybody in the effort to perpetuate its power and to suppress any opposition that was expressed to its imperialist campaign in Vietnam. That, of course, also echoes that today, in addition to this week that we have, beginning with the anniversary of the liberation of Saigon and the reunification of Vietnam, this is also another anniversary today, which is the anniversary of the May 4th movement in China in 1919. And when again, many young people, students, but also many other people joined in the streets of Beijing to protest against the betrayal of China by the victorious imperialist powers at Versailles, who were, clubbing together and awarding Chinese territory, which had been seized by Japan. They allowed them to keep that after World War I. And this was a complete betrayal, as I say, of the interests of the Chinese people, Chinese sovereignty, and simply another moment, another step on the path of imperialist exploitation in China as well. So we're here, we're gathering here today. I'm afraid I'm going to have to depart after my comments because I need to go to the commemorative events, which are going to start in just a little while. But what links, of course, the liberation of Saigon, what links the killings here at Kent State, what links the demonstrations in Beijing in 1919 is anti-imperialism, is the way in which ordinary people, working people in countries all around the world have repeatedly risen up, expressed their frustration, their hostility, their opposition, and their determination to resist and to push back against imperialism wherever it rises up, wherever it attempts to extend and maintain its power and its control. So when we think about, okay, we're celebrating this anniversary, we're commemorating these various things, what are the lessons that we draw from Vietnam? What are the lessons? What are the things that we need to know and we need to learn and we need to bear in mind going forward? And I want to just touch on sort of 3 aspects of this that I think kind of summarize or in some ways give us the guidance that we need. First is simply that the willingness, the need, the imperative to struggle, to fight, to push back, not just to say, oh, this is a terrible thing. Oh, we really sympathize with, the situation in Vietnam or the situation in China or the situation in Syria or Palestine, whatever it might be. We don't simply criticize that, but we struggle, we fight to resist and to change the world so that imperialism won't be the power that it is and has been for so long. And perseverance goes hand in hand with that, struggle and perseverance. And this, I think, is the most important lesson that we draw from Vietnam. The Vietnamese people, a heroic people, but, a small country, a poor country after almost a century of colonial exploitation, and then fighting against the French from 1945 to 1954. The United States then, after the Geneva Conference in 54, steps in as the neo-colonialist, trying to hang on to whatever scraps they could even though the liberation struggle was successful and the new government is in place in Hanoi and taking care of business in the northern part of Vietnam, the United States occupies the South, sets up a puppet military government, and tries to hang on. But those people, the Vietnamese people, they did not give up. They didn't look and say, oh, well, at least we got something out of this. They looked at it and they said, no, we want to have a unified country. We want to be independent. We want to be able to go about building a future. And for the Vietnamese people, that was a socialist future, a future of shared struggle, a future of shared prosperity. And that's something that they were very determined to do. And that tells us also, I think, kind of the second major lesson, which is that the liberation struggle in Vietnam relied upon the people. This was a people's struggle. This was not something that a political group, a little organization or a movement or something, a party, foisted out on society. This was a mass movement. This was a movement of the resistance, the heroism of people all through the country. And this, of course, was one reason why American imperialism was so brutal and so fierce in Vietnam, because it was impossible for them to separate the liberation fighters and the liberation organization from the people, because they were all one. And that unity, what Mao Zedong used to talk about as being like the fish in the sea. Well, if you've got the sea, then that's where you're going to win. So relying on the people, this is what the Vietnamese freedom movement did. This is what the liberation fighters did, and they were the people. There's not a dichotomy or a distinction there. And the final lesson, I suppose I would say, is to defy the odds. If you looked at the situation in Southeast Asia after World War II, and you looked at the efforts, by the mid-50s of the United States to intervene and change that situation and become the neo-colonial power, it seemed like a total, an immense mismatch. How could these people coming out of poverty, coming out of a country that had been oppressed and now divided, how could they possibly hope to stand up against American imperialism? But they did. They didn't make a sort of assessment and say, oh gosh, we just can't do this. They said, well, you know what? We're going to do this. This is something that we have to do, and we are going to persevere, and we are going to emerge victorious. And they took a brutal beating. The United States unleashed its vast military wealth, B-52 bombers trying to destroy Hanoi and the rest of North Vietnam. It was just a terrible campaign, imperialist campaign. And the Vietnamese people, they absorbed it. They rolled with the punch, if you will, and they persevered and they fought on. And eventually, by 1975, they drove the Americans out in 73, the American military forces. And then in 75, the country was reunified. Saigon was liberated. We all celebrated. We all, it was amazing, the feeling I know that we all shared at that time. And that was a victory that defied the odds. That was something that said, we don't care. And the reason I think that particular aspect of it is so important right now is because here in America, especially, we find ourselves in a very, very scary moment. We find ourselves with a fascist government trying to, undermine our existing order of things and take us even further to a society of oppression and racism and immiseration to the interests of capital and the perpetuation of imperialism. And so, many people I know today, here in the United States are kind of despairing. They're kind of disheartened. They look at the situation and they say, well, gosh, he has all the power, he's got Congress, he's got the courts, all this. And I say, the hell with that. What did the Vietnamese people say? They said, bring it on. They said, we will fight you. We will fight you every step of the way, and we will wear you down, and we will win. And they did win, and that's what we celebrate when we commemorate the liberation of Saigon. And that is the struggle that we need to carry in our hearts and as our inspiration for our fight today. So, thank you. You're still muted.
Yes, thank you so much, Ken. That was really such an important set of reflections and the key lessons we must draw from it. And as I should say to everyone that, one of the things that Ken was emphasizing is the extent to which the United States, the scale of the US commitment to winning this war. And Alan has just shared a graph showing US troop deployments in different parts of the world. And you can see that Korea was big, and then Vietnam was the biggest. And then since then, the United States troop deployments have never matched anything like what happened. And anyway, thank you very much, Ken. And so we'll now go to Kirill Whitaker. Kirill Whitaker is an independent researcher here in Britain on Vietnamese politics and history. So go ahead, Kirill.
Hi,
Oh,
thank you.
yes, great.
So I've made a few notes, and thank you for inviting me to this talk. I think it's very, very important, especially if you'd look in the media right now at the articles in mainstream newspapers. Wow, about what's happened and the 50 years on. There's a lot of misinformation out there, and that's kind of what I want to start what I'm talking about with. One of the main things that I found, one of the main reasons why I got into studying Vietnamese politics and political history was the fact that in Western countries especially, we're not really told much about Vietnam. We're not told about the Vietnamese people's struggles. We're not told about how they suffered under colonialism, and we're certainly not told about, further than the generalized bits and pieces, how they struggled underneath American imperialism. If you're very lucky, you probably have heard of things like My Lai. You've probably heard of things like Agent Orange. But those things were not just, the summation of what American imperialism was doing in Vietnam. It was commonplace. Many soldiers who came back from Vietnam who were horrified at what they saw recounted that things like My Lai happened on a weekly, maybe even daily basis. That kind of thing should shock anyone. And when we see conflicts happening that are spurred on by American imperialist interests today, especially when we look at things like Palestine or we look at places like Yemen, we can see similar acts. We can see a thread through history, and we can see the same things happening again. So in that respect, I think it's really important that we learn the lessons of Vietnamese history, and we also learn how history can repeat itself in those kinds of ways. One of the main things that you can see when you study Vietnam is also a thread that links the French colonial rule in Vietnam to the American imperialist rule in South Vietnam. There was an awful lot of similarities between the two because they had an awful lot of shared interests in why they were in Vietnam. They were very interested in taking as much as possible from the country, very interested in exploiting the labor of the people as much as possible, and giving the people of Vietnam very little in return. So I think it's also worthwhile to look at colonial history as well in Vietnam, and see how that feeds into what happened when America obviously invaded and landed troops on the ground. There's a few interesting facts about that. So what people might not know is in 1954, when the Vietnamese were winning against the French colonial forces at Dien Bien Phu, they were massively backed by the Americans. There's estimates that up to 80% of all the war costs at that time were footed by the American taxpayer. The French colonial generals sent people to America to talk with the American generals to figure out a plan to stop the Vietnamese people gaining their independence from French colonialism. And not only was a fleet of bombers talked about and discussed, flying over from the Philippines and bombing Dien Bien Phu, but also at one point, nuclear weapons were even discussed. That is the immense amount of atrocity that America was willing to commit, even very, very early on, before it even had boots on the ground. So it does stretch an awful long way back. And one thing you can also see in Vietnamese history is a resistance that stretches, arguably the Vietnamese would say themselves, throughout even before French colonialism, but certainly after the French colonized. There were various movements that sprung up and down the country, and they all had different ideas about how the Vietnamese nation should be ruled and what ideology it should go under and things like that. But a lot of these movements, the most popular amongst them, nationalist, royalist, and what is called Go East, which meant looking towards Japan, they all failed. And I think this is the first point that I want to make about lessons that we can learn from what happened in Vietnam. The first thing that the first lesson, I believe, is ideological grounding and correct assessment. One of the main reasons why the Vietnamese people won their war was because, first of all, they correctly assessed the society that they lived in. They were the party, the Communist Party of Vietnam, correctly assessed how Vietnamese history had developed, how the modes of production had developed. The cadres who were in the Communist Party of Vietnam were peasants and workers. I've recently wrote a book about the General Secretary of Vietnam, Le Yun, and he was working on the railways, unionizing the workers in the struggle against the French colonists. Those were the types of people that led the movement. They were aware of what was going on the ground. They had no grand idealist schemes. They were just analyzing what was happening, analyzing how it came to be that Vietnam had come under colonialism and how they could solve the problems and contradictions that they saw in society. This is important because when you look at Vietnam, especially when the Americans were there, but also when the French were there, the reason why there was such popular support for the Vietnamese Revolution was because of this correct analysis. The peasantry were behind the Communist Party of Vietnam because the Communist Party of Vietnam knew why they were in their position and they could help them out of that position. Yeah, if you read the writings of Ho Chi Minh, especially the earlier writings, he talks in immense depth about colonial society and how the peasantry live, and he compares and contrasts it to peasantries in other countries, and the same thing with the newly emerging proletariat there as well. Also in terms of women's liberation as well, which is something which is, it was very discussed in the 60s and 70s when the conflict was on, but it's not so discussed now about Vietnam. But one of the core motivations for the Vietnamese Revolution at the time as well was the fact that it correctly understood that women's oppression lay in class, first and foremost. And the Vietnamese communists were one of the only groups in society that directly challenged the exploitation that was going on and the feudal ideas about women's place in society and things like that. And that was a large motivating force as well for women to join the Vietnamese Revolution. You also had, obviously, a large grounding of a large determination to learn, to expand knowledge, to just like a thirst for knowledge. A lot of Vietnamese revolutionaries were thrown in jails in the most horrific conditions. Many of them died of disease and squalor whilst they were put away. But one of the things you'll notice if you read about any Vietnamese prison under French colonialism or under American imperialism is that they were always trying to sneak books in. They were always trying to set up classes. They were always trying to teach each other how to resist, how to learn more about Marxism, how to learn more from other struggles around the world and things like that. So there was a determination, there was a thirst for this ideological grounding as well. It wasn't just something which popped out of nowhere. It was something that, you know, the Vietnamese people really wanted. They really wanted to learn to see how they could get out of their situation. And I think that's important for us because when we analyze these events, we can't analyze them in a vacuum, especially with things like I mentioned earlier, like Palestine and like Yemen and places like that. We need to make sure that we analyze the history of these places and the contradictions that exist and how similar struggles have unfolded in different countries. The Palestinian struggle especially was very motivated by the Vietnamese victory, and they learned an awful lot from it. When Ho Chi Minh died, there was campaigns in Palestine named after him, in essence to try and further the revolutionary movement in Palestine as it was being furthered in Vietnam. The next thing that I want to talk about is international solidarity, which is also something that's been mentioned. International solidarity, if you would ask any Vietnamese diplomat or if you'd read the writings of people like Nguyen Thi Binh, international solidarity was a major part of why the Vietnamese people thought they were successful in their revolution, and why a lot of the arms and weapons and things like that didn't end up at their destination. And the US war machine is humongous. The French war machine was humongous. But even the little acts, the little things that people could do every day to resist and to stop those arms getting to where they needed to go helped the Vietnamese people. In my country, Britain, we had the Young Communist League, for example, donate bicycles to Vietnamese guerrillas and things like that. You had, at that time, you had a whole host of socialist countries who worked together to provide textbooks for Vietnamese children, donate blood en masse, raise money by buying matchboxes and all sorts of different things. That international solidarity made a big impact on the Vietnamese Revolution, and it even helped them once the Vietnamese Revolution was over. Because what a lot of people don't realize, or perhaps don't remember, is that there was a big struggle after the Vietnamese Revolution had ended, because there was 2 wars after that, and there was some of the harshest embargoes that have ever been placed on any country in history. And the Vietnamese people struggled immensely under those times, and it was only because of their fortitude and because of the international solidarity that they were receiving that they managed to get through those really difficult times. And I think that's a main lesson that we can learn as well, that we, even though we're not in these countries partaking directly in these struggles ourselves, we still have a big impact, even if we think it's just small everyday things. There's many different events. There was French communist women who lay on train tracks in France. There was people who hung the flag of the National Liberation Front over Notre Dame. Loads of different events, and even the very small ones, the Vietnamese fondly remember. And I think that's because they did make an impact, however small. It might have been material, or it might have been just to give them more motivation to see that actually they aren't alone in their struggle, and that there is a mass of people around the world who support them in their struggle.
Maybe you should wrap up now, Kirill.
Okay, thank you. I don't realize how long I talk sometimes. The last point that I really wanted to stress, and I'm going to go over it very quickly, was unity as well. So they talked a bit about the masses and how the masses worked and how they worked unified. Ho Chi Minh had a great quote. It was unity, great unity, success, great success. And that was a very large reason for why they were very successful, because of the unity and the discipline of the people. And I think that's also something that we can learn about in our movements as well. There was a lot of unity at that time, both in Vietnam and internationally, and I think that's something we can incorporate into our movements. So just to finish off, the 4 main messages, sorry. Importance of history. Make sure you're just learning about it all the time, busting all that propaganda that's out there, because people don't believe there is propaganda out there about Vietnam, but trust me, it is everywhere. Second one, ideological grounding and correct assessment. So again, it kind of links into the history. Third one, international solidarity. And fourth, unity. Thank you.
That was really excellent, Kirill. I think very systematic and very lively, and I think very true. So thank you so much. Yeah, it's I should have mentioned the book that you wrote. What was the name again? Could you please tell everyone? Ah,
Thank you.
yes.
It's not published yet. It will be published soon, hopefully this year. It will be called The Victory of Vietnam is the Victory of Socialism, Collected Writings and Selected Bibliography of Lê Yun. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so let's go to our next speaker. Our next speaker is John Catalinotto, and he is the author of a book called Turn the Guns Around, Mutinies, Soldier Revolts and Revolutions, which highlights the relation between rank and file soldier resistance and the struggle for state power. He's also the managing editor of the Workers' World newspaper in the United States. So John, please go ahead. Has somebody, oh yes, okay, yes.
Okay. Thank you, Radhika, and thank you, International Manifesto Group, for organizing this meeting, which is important to hold at this time when it's more likely to get an audience that's because of all the attention being paid to the revolution. I'm going to focus mainly on the United States, because that's where I am and that's what I know best about, and take you back 50 years for a moment. It was mid-April 1975. Our children were astonished by our change in behavior. Our tiny black and white television that usually stayed in a closed cabinet was on the breakfast table every morning. Our excitement doubled each day as we watched reports of the seemingly unstoppable march of the People's Liberation Armed Forces towards Saigon, the capital of the puppet regime in the South. We were far from being alone in the United States. There were tens of millions of people who ached for an end to the war. There were millions who had demonstrated against that war. There were hundreds of thousands who considered the fighters of the National Liberation Front and the North Vietnamese Army their heroes, marching toward victory. They rejoiced, we rejoiced. Not only was a long and brutal war ending, but the right side was winning. The oppressor was losing. We could hardly believe it. For 2 weeks, we watched the puppet army disintegrate. Once the soldiers in that army realized they were doomed to lose, they surrendered, or they got out of uniform and fled. The US government and media called it the fall of Saigon. I'm glad everybody here today has said the liberation of Saigon. An almost ridiculous phrase, the fall of Saigon, still used on the 50th anniversary of victory by the imperialist media. It was the rise of Ho Chi Minh City. It was the liberation of Vietnam, of a people who had sacrificed so much for decades to free their country from imperialism. And the ruling class that dragged the US youth into the criminal war was humiliated. Starting 13 years earlier, we had watched the US superpower send advisors, then helicopters, then massive numbers of troops. The US Air Force and Navy dropped bombs, napalms, then Agent Orange herbicides on the Vietnamese people and all of territory. It was a genocidal war. Maybe our first response was horror, maybe even pity. But as our understanding grew, it evolved into hatred for the US rulers. This was not our war, this was their war, and we were going to fight it. At the same time, we developed admiration at the courage of the Vietnamese and awe at their determination. We saw the strength and ability of their leaders. We learned to appreciate the aid of the socialist countries for the Vietnamese, the solidarity of the newly independent African countries, and we became part of a worldwide movement of solidarity ourselves. When I say we, I'm talking about the left, the communist, the anti-imperialist left that began to develop really because of the Vietnam War and of the Black Liberation Movement. The courage of the Vietnamese and their communist leadership inspired thousands of us to devote our lives to the worldwide class struggle. We learned not only to fight to bring the war to a halt, we learned to wage a battle against the imperialist ruling class that had unleashed that aggression. From the belly of the beast, we sided with the oppressed peoples and working class worldwide. We championed the National Liberation Front. We respected the organizations of the masses and the states that they had erected to defend themselves from imperialism. In the United States, mass demonstrations kept rallying more and more of the public to express opposition to the war. In November of 1969, 500,000 people demonstrated in Washington, from which 10,000 revolutionary youth put the Department of Justice under siege. And they terrified the very nasty Secretary of Injustice, actually, at the time, who was afraid that the revolution was knocking on his door. This movement had its sharpest political expression in two areas. One was the Black Liberation Movement, especially in its most revolutionary organizations like the Black Panthers. The other was within the armed forces itself. The troops showed opposition in many ways. They malingered. They refused to go into battle. Entire units refused to follow orders. Incarcerated troops burned down stockades. Troops eliminated hundreds of racist or overly aggressive officers and non-commissioned officers. They added a verb to the English language, to frag. It meant to kill an officer with a fragmentation grenade. Some 900 fragging events took place, officially recorded between 1969 and 1972. That was recorded by a Marine colonel who was outraged by what was going on in his military. Meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of other U.S. youth refused conscription, going underground, going to jail, going to Canada, and continuing to organize there. I've seen on the screen someone who did exactly that. So the organization was going on within the Army, within the United States, and within the exiled U.S. Americans who were also fighting the war. Rank-and-file soldiers formed the American Servicemen's Union. This was my personal focus. The idea behind the union was that the imperialist armed forces mimicked the structures of civilian class society. The rank-and-file soldiers, sailors, Marines, and Air Force personnel were the workers. The non-coms, the officers, were the management. They gave the orders. They served the big capitalist bosses. The troops began to show their class opposition to the officers and to the orders of the imperialist rulers. The goal of the Union was to break the chain of command, to end the war on the Vietnamese, and if possible, to bring the struggle home. This military resistance had its impact on the war itself. So, General Westmoreland asked President Johnson at the time for another 500,000 troops. The White House knew that to escalate the troop count to 1 million might cause the military to implode. When Johnson asked Westmoreland, will you win the war? Westmoreland says, well, we can't be sure. Maybe we'll need another 1 million, So Johnson said no, and then in 1969, under the Richard Nixon administration, he began to withdraw U.S. troops from Vietnam from its peak of 540,000. By early 1973, almost all the U.S. troops were out. Conscription, that is the draft, which civilian youth also resisted, had ended. The U.S. turned to an air war, which meant much fewer casualties, of course, of the U.S. side, although it continued to create casualties amongst the Vietnamese, Laotians, and Cambodians who were being bombed. The South, to show you the importance of this, the South Vietnamese People's Liberation Armed Forces issued a document on April 26, 1971. One paragraph of it orders its officers and men, quote, to welcome and give good treatment to those U.S. servicemen who cross over to the South Vietnam people and the People's Liberation Armed Forces, to stand ready to help them go home or seek asylum in another country if requested by them. This, by the way, is what communists do when they can, when the situation presents itself as a possibility. Let's give no false impressions. It was the Vietnamese people and their courageous fighters who won the battle. And theirs was also a political and diplomatic battle, which they waged skillfully. But the refusal of U.S. troops, of the youths who refused the draft, of all in the U.S. who threw a wrench in the war machine, accelerated that victory. Now, in 2025, on the 50th anniversary of that victory of the Vietnamese people, humanity faces the same worldwide class conflict that was taking place then, even if it has taken a different form. The center of struggle in terms of open war is the atrocious assault by the settler state of Israel, fully armed and backed by US and Western European imperialism, against the Palestinian people. The world has seen the genocide against Gaza streamed on social media, and we have watched a massive change in the popular attitude toward the criminal Israeli state and toward the United States because of Gaza. This change, and I'm talking about within the United States especially, this change has taken place despite the ongoing ruling class propaganda campaign demonizing the Gaza leadership and all the forces of what has been called the axis of resistance, including Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis or Ansarallah in Yemen, and the Iranian government. With regard to the different form of that worldwide struggle, the current decline of U.S. imperialist hegemony has been discussed in other webinars in the International Manifesto Group. I'll just say here that neither the establishment ruling class Democrats nor the Trump MAGA group has a program that can reverse the decline of U.S. imperialism. By dismantling 80 years of U.S. diplomacy, the Trump faction appears to be accelerating that decline and spurring a struggle within the United States, as people have mentioned already. As with Vietnam, we are in awe of the Palestinians for their determined resistance despite all the suffering, despite the genocide. We are in awe of their resilience and of the persistence of their leaders. What is the lesson from Vietnam? Vietnam won. Palestine can win. Palestine will win sooner if a worldwide movement of solidarity can continue to grow, can develop and be able to take actions that throw wrenches or shoes into the imperialist Zionist war machine. Some billions of people around the world now consider Israel a pariah state, a genocidal state, as they once did apartheid South Africa. They consider those states that arm Israel, the United States and Western Europe, the criminal facilitators of genocide. Those who understand that U.S. imperialism is the center of the oppressive world system realize that the U.S. leaders are themselves guilty of genocide as much as their cronies in Tel Aviv. This is true whether these leaders are named Obama or Biden and are Democrats, or if they are the MAGA, Trump, open chauvinist, racists. Well, I'll leave that other names out for now. Young people in the United States, many of them students, waged the battle on campuses all last year, and they're continuing that battle. The May Day demonstration this week, which was mainly directed at the excesses of the new Trump administration, showed a mass movement in birth, and where possible, it reflected the sentiment about Palestine. The challenge to us, those of us in the United States who identify as anti-imperialist, as communist, who are in solidarity with the liberation of Palestine, is to mobilize that mass sentiment and turn it into a factor in the ongoing struggle. Just as in that earlier struggle which Vietnam won, Palestine can win now. There is no lack of courage in Gaza. There is no lack of determination of the leadership. But it is up to the most conscious elements in this developing movement to find a way to make the movement a force that can aid the Palestinian people win their liberation. And that will be a blow for all of you on the side of all of humanity. This is a task for all who want peace and liberation for humanity. Vietnam won. Palestine can win. Palestine will win. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that was so important. Both you and Kirill John are connecting your remarks to the Palestinian struggle, which is so acutely important today, and also, of course, your narrative of what the soldiers did, which is also important because at the end of the day, soldiers are human beings, and their refusal to fight unjust wars has always been a very important element of history. So thank you very much for reminding us of that. We will now go to our final speaker. Our final speaker is KJ No. KJ is a journalist, political analyst, and peace activist with a focus on East and Southeast Asia. So KJ, please go ahead. Are you muted? Yes.
Yes, so I'm
yes,
sharing
unmuted.
my slides. Can you see my slides?
Yes. And if you don't mind, you could go reading mode. If you go to view and choose reading mode, I think it will look better. That's it. That
Yes.
looks perfect. Lovely. Thanks.
Yes. So this is my presentation, Dare to Struggle, Dare to Win, which is a slogan of the time. And it's really about the lessons from, as the Vietnamese call it, the resistance war against America to save the nation. I want to be straight up. For me, it's very clear that this was a war that was genocidal in intent and execution. And it also ties into a vast colonial project that was related to the exploitation of rubber. This was one of the rubber plantations in Indochina, as Tran Tu Binh, who was on a rubber plantation at the time, he said every day one was worn down a little bit more, cheeks sunken, teeth gone crooked, eyes hollow with dark circles around them. Everyone appeared almost dead. And in fact, in the end, about all did die. The statistics showed that that the death rates on most plantations was between 12 and 47%, and that 90% of the workers suffered from malaria. And of course, when the US became involved as a kind of successor colonizing force, one of the things that Henry Kissinger said, he said that I cannot believe a fourth-rate power does not have a breaking point. And in order to make this possible, they created this thing called the body count, which McNamara was always obsessed with. He would always say, give me metrics, give me metrics. But essentially, by creating a body count, this became a genocidal project. We can see this, of course, from the images of the time, setting villages ablaze. We know from the massive bombings that were exercised, that were done indiscriminately. We know that the bombers, the Air Force pilots on these planes would come back from a bombing raid and they would throw up because the stench of burning flesh was so intense that it would rise up into the plane and it would get into their hair, into their uniforms, and inside the interior of the plane. And I still have Vietnam veteran comrades who cannot go to a barbecue because it immediately triggers their PTSD. And of course, we see people running for their lives because nowhere was safe. The entire southern area was turned into what was called a free fire zone. This is something called Project Phoenix, or the Phoenix program. This was a program of counterinsurgency. It was essentially an assassination program. And at its height, they were killing between 5,000 and 10,000 civilians, what they referred to as VC, but were clearly civilians. They were killing 5,000 to 10,000 civilians every single month. And this was funded by USAID. If you have liberal friends who think that USAID is a good organization, point them to CORDS, and the Phoenix program during the Vietnam War. This is more of the Phoenix program. And of course, torture was routine. If you were lucky, you got the helicopter treatment. If you were not lucky, you were sent into a tiger cage. And these tiger cages were actually made later by Kellogg, Brown, and Root, which became Halliburton. But people would be forced into these cages, sometimes spending years inside them. When they came out, they were no longer capable of erect, upright movement. Still, the Vietnamese fought with an incredible resilience, and using a battery of air rifles, and then guns and carbines, and then missiles and anti-aircraft fire, they were able to shoot down multiple planes. In fact, 12,000 airplanes and helicopters were shot down by the NVA and the National Liberation Front. And fallen planes are now just part of the landscape in Vietnam. And of course, everybody fought, men and women. People think that these are staged images, but hardly, not at all. These were actually active combatants who did some of the most incredible acts of valor during the war. This is William A. Robinson. He was an American pilot. He was captured. This is another American pilot, Dewey Wayne Waddell, in 1967. And of course, the Americans did not get out of this easily. Even Lyndon B. Johnson was apparently aggrieved when he heard a recording from his son-in-law. But all of this has a continuity with other imperial wars. We are remiss if we think that Vietnam was unique or even singular unto itself. All of these wars have been simply wars, imperial wars, that have shifted and moved from one region to another. But the imperial project has been a singular one. This is in Korea, what we call the Podo League massacres. In 1948 to 1950, anybody who was suspected of being communist or moderately leftist or progressive was simply killed en masse. We estimate somewhere in the range of 200,000 comrades were slaughtered. These are other images of the Podo League massacres. Of course, these were all attributed to North Korea. And of course, we know of the genocidal bombings. We know about the strategic hamlets, which we should really understand as napalm. There was systemic politicide, which prefigured what happened in Indonesia, which has been popularized in a book called The Jakarta Method. All of this had a precedent and was transmitted across Asia and the global South. It was nothing that was singular to Vietnam, but happened all over the global South, where people were rising up and fighting for liberation and trying to institute socialist nations. This is the Malayan emergency, what the British were doing in counterinsurgency. And the Malayan emergency is atrocious and also completely erased from history. And it wasn't even called a war. They called it an emergency because this would allow them to get the insurance from Lloyd's Bank, which had insured them. If it was a war, they would not be able to recoup their insurance premiums. But if they called it an emergency, which was simply an ugly, dirty counterinsurgency war that was filled with mass atrocities, they could recover their insurance costs as well. And the other dirty thing that the Malayan emergency brought is that the British pioneered the use of herbicides during the Malayan emergency. And that became normalized, so that when the Vietnam War broke out, instead of considering it a form of chemical warfare, which it was, and which it should have been completely banned, because the British had normalized it during the Malayan Wars, the Americans started to spray Agent Orange everywhere. This is a mangrove swamp after it has been sprayed with Agent Orange. This is what it might have looked like before, an incredible, rich ecosystem that supports life, but then it was turned into this. And of course, we know that Agent Orange, not only is it associated with 17 different diseases, but of course, we know that it causes birth defects. And we know that somewhere in the range of 3 million children in Southeast Asia suffer from birth defects related to Agent Orange. We know that 400,000 people died from the effects of Agent Orange. We know that 20 million gallons were sprayed. And of course, when the imperialists fight, they always use their proxies. So there were the South Koreans, there was South Vietnamese, but also the South Koreans. This is the White Horse Division, which perpetrated multiple atrocities inside of Vietnam. And then after they returned to South Korea, they initiated a coup, and they were later responsible. The Vietnam serving South Korean troops were responsible for the Gwangju massacre in 1980. And so the violence doesn't stay abroad. It always comes back home. 340,000 South Korean troops served in Vietnam. They were the second largest contingent after the United States. And after 1972, the Koreans outnumbered the Americans 2-1. This is Bernardo Simpson. He's somebody who was at My Lai during the My Lai massacre. He confesses to have killed 20 children and women. He later shot himself in the head. This is the My Lai massacre, and I will warn people that some of these images are going to be very disturbing. This was the ditch where scores of women and children were killed. You can see that their bodies are naked because they've been raped. And of course, it all goes back to the body count and the ugly crossover point. But still, the Vietnamese fought. This is the NVA in combat. This is the NVA doing a flanking maneuver against the South Vietnamese Army. And if you know anything about military strategy, you can see that they've gotten completely to the side. So they're going to blindside these Arvin troops. The Americans didn't get off lightly in this war, even when they exercised incredible force with operations such as Operation Cedar Falls. They were not able to flush out the National Liberation Front. And of course, this is the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which the US was never able to stop functioning. The extraordinary courage and discipline and energy and stamina of the Vietnamese kept this trail alive. And it was like the spine that kept the war going. There's a line from Con Son prison. It was graffiti inscribed on the prison walls. And I think it captures the spirit of the Vietnamese. The mountain is only so high. Our capacity is without limit. The stars move. Our will is unshakable. And I also want to share with you this image, which is quite an extraordinary image. Again, it speaks to us of the extraordinary courage and dedication of, for example, doctors in Gaza. This is a surgery set up in a swamp. And if you look down, you'll see that the doctors and the nurses, they're up to their knees in water, but still they believe in the sanctity and the preciousness of every single life. And so they're conducting surgery in a field hospital, which is diametrically opposed to what General Westmoreland said when he said that in Asia, lives are cheap. Far from it. Every single life was so precious that you would see these extraordinary acts of care and love and heroism happening daily. This was a young NLF agent. She was arrested and sentenced to a military court to 20 years of hard labor. After receiving her sentence, she faced the jury and said, "Will your government last long enough to imprison me for 20 years?" And of course, they didn't last. She only served 6, and then she was liberated, and she became an official in the Vietnamese government. These are the final days. Of course, we know these images. This is an image which you may not know, but this is a similar situation where a Vietnamese man is trying to get on a plane and he's being punched in the face by an American who's trying to close the door on him. This was civil air transport, which was actually the helicopter that you saw taking off from the embassy. It was also referred to as Air America. They trafficked troops, secret missions, and they also flew drugs. And this civil air transport was actually the national airline of the Taiwan authorities. This is one of the final images of the liberation just before the NVA entered Saigon. All of the ARVN, South Vietnamese troops, stripped off their uniforms and took their boots off, and then they just ran for cover. And so this is almost an image that looks biblical. It looks like the rapture, but it's simply ARVN troops, South Vietnamese troops, running tail and trying to hide themselves as civilians. Of course, we know that the Chinese are marching in the 50th anniversary celebration. And of course, this is because 320,000 Chinese troops served. We also know that there was massive resistance across the world, as has already been pointed out. This is Berkeley, 1968. This is a very, very idealistic person. He was at the time, his name was John Kerry. He's no longer the same person, but he was speaking out as part of Vietnam Veterans Against the War. These were the communists in Japan. They put a brutal resistance against the war and Japan's participation in it. Japan was one of the key staging grounds for the bombing. This is Chicago, 1968, Sweden, 1973. This was in the East Coast, 1969. And of course, as has already been mentioned, the veterans' resistance was fundamental to breaking the back of the US will to fight. One of the reasons for that is because over 500,000 veterans went AWOL. They defected from the war. And according to the government's own statistics, they estimate that somewhere close to 1 million years of service hours were rendered ineffective during the war. In other words, something close to 100 divisions were disabled during the war because of veterans' resistance. Of course, there is this line, which is actually associated with Muhammad Ali. This is Muhammad Ali helping a veteran who is suicidal, keeping him from jumping off. But he said, you know, I'm not going to go 10,000 miles from home to help murder and burn another poor nation, simply to continue the domination of white slave masters of the darker people the world over. And of course, this is Muhammad Ali with Malcolm X. He says, the real enemy of my people is here. This is Operation Dewey Canyon 3, when 800 veterans threw away their medals. As I said, once again, 1 million troops refused to fight. 503,000 deserted. There were, towards the end of the war, approximately 2 fraggings a day. And there were riots on Travis Air Force Base, on the Kitty Hawk, and on USS Forrestal, where somebody set a fire to sabotage the boat and created $7 million worth of damage. Of course, there was Cuban solidarity. There was Chinese solidarity. Chinese deployed 320,000 troops, and at the peak of their deployment, 170,000 People's Liberation Army troops were fighting in the Vietnam War. The US never attempted a land invasion of North Vietnam because the Chinese said, if you invade North Vietnam, it is going to be exactly the same thing as Korea, where we kicked your rear all the way down to the 38th parallel. Here's one more thing which I think is important to know, is that there were the Paris peace talks, and Avril Harriman and the North Vietnamese troops, a North Vietnamese team met in Paris. Avril Harriman, who was the ambassador at large, rented a room. He booked a room at one of the most luxurious hotels in the center of Paris, and he booked it for 2 weeks. The Vietnamese delegation, because they didn't have the budget, they booked a small cottage far on the outskirts of Paris in a place called Châtillon. But the difference between the Vietnamese and the Americans was that the Vietnamese booked, they rented that cottage. They took out a 3-year contract on that cottage. And so they understood that this was going to take a long time and that they were in it for the long haul. The Americans expected to be done, and they expected the Vietnamese to capitulate within 2 weeks. And we know very clearly who won. So this is the importance of long-term thinking, of strategic long-term thinking. This is a very young Ho Chi Minh in the back over here. Over here is Park Geun-hye. He is actually the founder of the Korean Labor Party, the Communist Party. This is Alice Hyun, who single-handedly destroyed the counterintelligence corps in Korea. And so once again, you can see this incredible global solidarity from all over Asia. This was the Moscow Toilers of the East. I want to end by saying that there are 3 things that we should take from this. One is that everybody can do something to fight the colonial imperial regime. And it can be as simple as dropping a little pebble in the shoe. Armies march, and if you put a little pebble in their shoe, that can disable them as much as a full skirmish. The second thing I want to point out is an image that I have called the cashew tree. The image below is the world's largest tree on the planet. It is actually a cashew tree, and it is a single tree because it is connected by the roots to every other tree, and it covers several acres. This is really a metaphor for solidarity, the way that we can be deeply and fundamentally connected and supporting each other in this foundational idea of global solidarity and not a kind of a superficial, virtues, not in a virtue signaling way. And then the last thing I want to bring out is this concept from Tai Chi, which is that you find the center of your partner or your opponent's balance, and then you unbalance from that, because this comes from the understanding that in any agonistic situation, there are three forces. There's your force, there's the other antagonist force, and then there is the force of gravity. That force of gravity is the most powerful force. And the person who is most deeply aligned with that gravitational force is the person who will prevail. In the case of Vietnam and the National Liberation Front and the NVA, they were most deeply aligned with their integrity and their desire for liberation, whereas the Americans were simply tourists thinking that they could easily dominate what they considered to be a weak and fragile nation. That never happened. The Chinese and the Vietnamese and the Russians came out ahead, and this was a great victory for global South liberation. The last point I want to make is the importance of understanding socialist struggles as also national liberation struggles. Without national liberation, without the understanding that you create a sovereign state, the approaches to building socialism don't work. You don't get to simply build a big bike co-op and imagine that that is going to create socialism for you. Korea tried it. It was wiped out in the Border League massacres. Indonesia tried it. It was wiped out all across the Indonesian archipelago. What needs to happen is that a sovereign socialist state needs to be built that implements long-term and strategic planning in solidarity with other socialist states and with other socialist allies. And if that is possible, if you build from that, then we have the possibility to create a better alternative world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, KJ. That was so brilliant that I didn't have the heart to impose any time limit on you. So I have absolutely no idea how long you went on, but thank you very much. I think, and maybe you could, yeah, you have stopped sharing screen. Great. Great. So I'm sure there will be lots of comments, questions, and so on. I know there are lots of people here who were themselves in one way or another participants in all of this. And of course, others who are keenly interested. And also, I wonder if the speakers themselves want to offer comments to one another. So all of these things are open. I have 3 hands up already. But before I go to them, can I just take a minute to announce our next webinar, which will be next Sunday, marking another very important anniversary, which will, so on Sunday, the 18th of May, we will be hosting a webinar called The Fight Against Fascism, Then and Now, 80 years after the defeat of Nazism. The way we think about it is that May 9th marks 80 years since the Soviet-led victory over Nazi Germany and the end of the Second World War in Europe. Which was, of course, one of the most significant events in the history of the world and in the struggle against socialism. And despite the Soviet Union's indispensable contribution, despite the fact that the Red Army liberated Auschwitz, despite the fact that the Soviets lost overwhelmingly the most lives in that struggle, Western historians and politicians have consistently tried to belittle its role. And today, this year, the victory in Europe is going to be marked by really macabre distortions of history. So we want to hold this webinar to discuss it. Some confirmed speakers are Richard Sakwa, who is the very well-known professor of Russian and European politics, who, of course, has been facing attempts to discredit him, and so recently, Oleg Barabanov, who is the program director of the Valdai Discussion Club, Pavel Vargan, who is political coordinator of the Progressive International, Kit Klarenberg, who is an investigative journalist, Ludmila Bulavka-Buzgalina, professor at the Moscow University, Lomonosov University, Andrew Murray of the Stop the War Coalition and Morning Star, and Lotte Rotov-Madsen, chair of the Danish Communist Party. So it's quite a lineup. So I hope many of you will come, and please also help us by spreading the word of these events. In fact, help not just us, but really help spread the sort of questioning of the massive disinformation that is going on in the mainstream media and by our governments, by spreading the word. So with that, I will go to the questions. Okay, so I'm going to take the first 3 questions, and then I'd like to ask the speakers who are still here. So Ken also had to leave, so it's going to be John and Kirill and KJ. I'm going to ask you to respond to the questions, and also feel free to use that opportunity to respond to one another. Okay, Dee, please go ahead. Let me ask you to unmute yourself. You should now be able to unmute yourself. Great.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Well, I was especially inspired by both KJ and John with their focus on both the massive popular resistance as well as the organized resistance of US soldiers and sailors in solidarity with the Vietnamese. And I specifically would ask both, and perhaps first KJ, to discuss the recent and current popular struggle in Korea, where US-backed president tried to foment a fake war, and a popular mobilization was able to defeat it. My question really is whether, in KJ's opinion, there is a possibility that this mass struggle can help to do 2 major things: undermine the U.S.-backed assault force of the 500,000 member Korean forces, and also help to pressure U.S. soldiers and sailors stationed in Korea. I believe they number about 30,000. That would be a substantial help in preventing U.S. aggression against China and North Korea.
So, Dee, you have asked a really great question. I'm going to try to be as brief as possible.
Sorry, KJ, I'm going to take 2 more questions and then come to the speakers. No worries. Thanks. Okay, so Yuri and then Carlos. Sorry, 1 second, Yuri. Okay, there you go. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Professor Desai, and thank you to the International Manifesto Group. All right, I have my questions to Mr. No, KJ No. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about the South Korean anti-war movement in South Korea, because South Korea, alongside Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Israel, Britain secretly fought on the side of the US. And I'm just curious if you could talk about the South Korean anti-war movement, the repression that was met on them, and how is Vietnam remembered or even discussed in South Korea? And do you think that it's long overdue that the global left, particularly the Western left, stopped practicing anti-communism leftism? Thank you.
Thanks so much, KJ. And then, sorry, Yuri, and then Carlos, please.
Thanks, Radhika, and thanks so much to all of the speakers for very brilliant presentations. Just thinking about what are the lessons from Vietnam for our struggles today, which is one of the aims of today's session. Clearly, one of the most important is that it was the high watermark of the global united front against imperialism, in that it incorporated the socialist countries, all the socialist countries, the national liberation movements, and the progressive anti-war and working class movements in the advanced capitalist countries. Of course, the Vietnamese people bore the brunt of that struggle and they deserve the bulk of the credit for that extraordinary victory. But the other components also had their part to play. And KJ talked in some detail about, the support from the Soviet Union, from People's China, from the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, from Cuba. And that's a story that actually hasn't been properly told. Too few people know about it, while as KJ said, the South Korean dictatorship was sending thousands of troops to support the puppet South Vietnamese forces on instructions from and with payment from Washington. The GPRK actually sent an Air Force regiment to help defend North Vietnam, and Kim Il-sung called on the North Korean pilots to fight in the war as if the Vietnamese sky were their own. Cuba sent military advisors from thousands of miles away. As KJ mentioned, China sent vast quantities of weapons, troops, advisors. Soviet Union sent advanced weaponry, fighter jets, and so on. And when you meet Vietnam vets from Eastern Europe, these are people that worked as engineers, doctors, and so on, carrying out their internationalist duty. There are Vietnam vets, not just in North America, but also in Poland, in East Germany, and all the rest of it. A story that has been told a lot more comprehensively, at least here in the West, is that of the anti-war movement. And its importance is maybe sometimes a bit exaggerated, ultimately because Hollywood prefers to give agency to white people, even when it doesn't like their politics. It was nonetheless very important in making the war unpopular and increasingly untenable for the imperialists. 50 years later, today's world is kind of different in many ways, but the fundamental dynamic of imperialism and the struggle of the global working class against it continues to exist. And so on that basis, I think, it's really imperative we seek to emulate the global united front that was constructed in support of Vietnam. This is a global united front that has to join hands to support Palestinian freedom and end genocide, that's got to join hands to demand an end to NATO's proxy war against Russia and Ukraine, demand an end to the campaign of encirclement and containment of China, that must work in a systematic and coordinated way to support multipolarity, to end hegemony and imperialism, to support sovereignty such that the peoples of the world can choose their own path to development. Because as Ho Chi Minh so famously put it, nothing is more precious than independence and freedom. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Carlos. Okay, so I guess we'll go in the following order. We'll have KJ and then John and then Kirill.
So very briefly responding to Dee's question, which is actually could be a very, very long answer, but the South Koreans resisted Yoon's attempt at a martial law coup. I am of the opinion that this was green-lighted by the United States because they were very, very happy to have Yoon become a dictator, because once he's a dictator, it facilitates their process of escalation to war against China. Those who know something about Korean geopolitics should understand that the United States, to this day, controls South Korea's 500,000 regular troops and 3.1 million reserve troops, 3.6 million troops. That's the world's largest military manpower, larger than China and Russia combined. The US has operational control over those troops and is an incredible force projection platform that it is seeking to use as it escalates to war against China. So Yoon was supposed to facilitate that, but he made a lot of mistakes. He is currently being impeached. He's facing criminal charges for insurrection. And Lee Jae-myung, who is the opposition party leader, was considered to be the shoo-in to be the next president. And he would have rebalanced with China, and he would have de-escalated the war against China. And he would have broken ties with Japan and been more of an obstacle to the US agenda, which is why the US hates him. And currently what has happened 3 days ago, on May 1st, there was a judicial coup in which the Supreme Court has essentially remanded a court case that was acquitted back to the appellate court with the direction that Lee Jae-myung should be found guilty and therefore stripped of his candidacy for presidency. And then this will open the way for another US quisling to become elected, most notably Han Duck-soo, who was until very recently the acting president and the prime minister. So we are not out of the woods yet. Multiple twists and turns. The entire country is in an outrage, and it is on the verge of civil war because the Koreans do not want the fascists to gain power again. They've overthrown the fascists they tried to overthrow them in 1948, 1960, 1972, 1979, 1980, 1987, and 2015. And they did it again, 2025, and it looks like the zombie is still coming back. So Korea is still under tremendous pressure and is in a very precarious state. Regarding Yuri's question about the South Korean anti-war movement during the Vietnam War, I can honestly tell you that it was non-existent. And the reason why it was non-existent is because South Korea was a military dictatorship at the time. 340,000 South Korean troops served in the Vietnam War under the control of the United States, but you did not get a peep of resistance against it, except for some very quiet, statements in certain liberation theology circles. And because of that, I believe that South Korea owes a tremendous debt of apology and reparation to the Vietnamese people. I have seen grade school children write apology notes and publicize them for the Vietnamese public, but the government itself does not have the maturity or the ethics of a 12-year-old, and therefore this is something which is sorely lacking and still needs to be done.
Thanks, KJ. John, please go ahead.
Oh, okay. From the point of view of the South Korean situation, I can't say much. KJ has explained what's going on. And we, for our side in the United States, will do our best to promote the views of the South Korean labor movement and the South Korean progressive movement in its attempt to prevent a right-wing retakeover of the government. And we will publicize it and demonstrate as we can in the United States in solidarity with the people of South Korea against the military and against the U.S. occupation forces. With regard to something, I wanted to take up a little something about the current world situation that Carlos brought up, because there's no way we can magically reproduce the situation that existed in 1969, 1970, when there was a socialist camp and they worked together to support the Koreans in what was a global class war really going on of the socialist world against the imperialist world, with the working class and all the oppressed nations potentially on the side of the socialist world. And this situation does not exist. At the same time, though, US imperialism, from the point of view of its own hegemonic role inside the imperialist camp, is much diminished at this time and has created a new situation that is both very dangerous and also prevents opportunities of rapid ideological change and development, because the masses of the population, also in the imperialist countries, are in a fragile situation because of the economic decline of the imperialist states. And there doesn't seem to be any way that the ruling class groupings have of answering this situation except to prepare war. And everything else is failing. That will probably fail too, but it should be our role to try and prevent it from getting to that point where there has to be a war for it to fail, that we could sabotage the effort to prepare for the war before it happens. And that's what I think we have to be confident that there is going to be an opportunity for struggle. It is already broken out in a way in the United States that, like I explained in the talk, in the change that is taking place in a sector of the population, that we were at this May Day demonstration, we were next to it and chanting my favorite. We were in solidarity with the Palestinians because we wanted to make that position presented to the entire demonstration. And we started chanting, "Palestine is our fight, workers of the world unite." And the workers who marched by, a lot of them picked up the chant and just repeated it. So it showed that you couldn't imagine this happening a few years ago in the United States. Things are political development, like everything else in nature, is always in change. And we have to look at these things in change and in the possibility of change, and with the confidence that we can raise our position and get it acceptable, and that it can be move people as the situation also moves them, as their experience moves them. So that's just what I want to say. We're going to have to build a new model for international solidarity than was possible at the time of the Vietnam War. But we're going to do it. That's it.
Thank you, John. And Kieran, please. Oh, yes, of course. Sorry. There. Okay.
Thank you. Again, I don't think I can say too much about South Korea. What I will say as well is, and I'm not sure if it was mentioned in the presentations, but we should also remember other countries as well backed the US and sent troops into Vietnam as well. I'd be remiss, my comrade from Australia, Max, if I didn't mention that Australians were a very big part of the atrocities that happened in Vietnam as well. Concerning Carlos's question, I think the most important things are what I started my talk off with, which is, first, I think one of the major things that we need to do in order to create more unity around the movement and to be able to be a stronger movement for advocating for nations trying to free themselves from imperialist grip, is to try our best to constantly expose lies as we see them and propaganda as we see them, because they are present in our everyday lives. And although we have social media and like Twitter and Facebook and other places that work as a good avenue for us to be able to expose those things, as we're seeing all too often recently, even those forums are set to restrictions because obviously the people who control them do not share our interests. They do not want to uncover these things. Their interests are aligned with their pockets and with their friends' pockets. So I think it's, that's one of the major things that we have to do. We just have to keep speaking out and keep uncovering propaganda wherever we see it. One of the major things with Vietnam, if you have a look in the most bookstores in the UK, if you read some of the books, they are absolutely atrocious and they do not even reference properly and they make things up. One of the things I was most shocked about and made me write my book was the fact that people were lying, just making things up about Vietnamese political figures. And you wouldn't believe it unless you read it and you went in there. But yeah, I think that's the first thing we can do. And then the second thing is just organization. So again, going back to that Ho Chi Minh quote, Unity, unity, great unity, success, success, great success. And the reason it works in that way is because you have a bit of unity and you have a bit of success, and then the unity grows and so too do your successes. So having a look at being part of an organization if you're not part of an organization, and utilizing our current unity. There's a lot of people who are out there who are protesting, who are organizing, who are, speaking out on workers' rights, on imperialist atrocities abroad and things like that. But if they're not united, if they're not organized, then they have a lot less impact. And in the final run, there's an awful lot less that they can do. So organization and unity is something that I think we should really stress.
Great, thanks. And I think those are very well taken points. So I hope everyone was listening hard. We have two more questions and I will take them, and we'll have one final round of answers and then we can wrap up, I think. So we have Ian Del Sol and Dr. Koo, who I think is probably our good friend, Dr. Kim and Koo. So Ian, please go ahead. 1 second, I will, there. You should be able to unmute now.
Okay. Yes, thank you. I've been listening with interest this wonderful history of the struggles between socialism and capitalism. And I think democratic socialism is based on the will of the majority of the people rather than on the will of the elite minority. Now, to measure that, we have to advocate perhaps for referendums, which is the basis for direct democracy. And instead of having representatives that tell us what we think, every citizen should be a legislator of our own policies. So socialist democrats, or democratic socialists rather, would perhaps be better off advocating for referendum, legislation by referendum, because then we have our own rules, our own will. So especially now, because we have a computerized technology coming into this age, that maybe during Vietnam War and Korean War, those tools were not available. So we were more dependent on the elite telling us, this is what people want. We're defending the rights of the people. But now we can say that's not true, because we can prove it to you. If we advocate for a referendum, then through referendum, we would show that not most people believe and support in Israel, and not most people support and support in Ukraine. So if we can prove that through a referendum, then even if the government doesn't right away make it a binding decision in Parliament, at least it will show that they are wrong. So I wonder if the speakers think, what do they think about this idea of direct democracy by referendum?
Thank you. And Dr. Koo, please.
Okay, what I wanted to do is that I wanted to thank KJ for putting out a little bit on Malaya. I come from Malaysia originally, and I understand a little bit about the struggle of the Malayan Communist Party. And my understanding is that, a lot of the struggles in Southeast Asia was against Japanese fascism during the Second World War. And when the Japanese bombed and sunk two of the British warships on the off the coast of Singapore, the Prince of Wales and Repulse, what happened was that the British just left, and they turned tail and just left Malaya open to the Japanese fascists. And the main fighters for the independence and against the Japanese fascism was the Malayan Communist Party. And a lot of them are also a lot of them stayed hidden within the central mountains, and they get their food and sustenance from the villagers there. where after Second World War is done, the British came back as though they are the victors, they are the fighters, and they claim Malaya back. And what happened is that when they found out that the MCP was giving them a lot of resistance, I think General Montgomery was the one that instituted this thing called strategic villages, in which they try to shut off the food and the support from the villagers to the Malayan Communist Party. The other problem is that when they lost that support, they became somewhat weak, and then the British came out with this idea about if you drop your arms and you come out and surrender, we will forgive you. And that's kind of the beginning of the fall of the Malayan Communist Party and the inability for Malaya, at that time, the Federation of Malaya, to turn socialist. So I just kind of wanted to give the little bit of background, because I think it's really important that we understand why the Chinese Revolution was so successful, because they not only had support from the peasants, but they were actually the ones producing their own food and sustenance, and was able to carry on in spite of encirclement by the KMT and the Western imperialists. So if KJ wants to comment, or anybody else want to comment on that, I would appreciate it. Thank you.
That's great. And one more question has just come in. So I think since we are taking 3 at a time, I'll give Stephen Tyke a chance to ask his question. Stephen, now you'll be able to unmute.
Okay. I'm sorry I came in late, so I missed some things, but I'm an older person. I've been around a lot. I was a conscientious objector during the Vietnam War, and I have been to a lot of the lands, and I'm a psychiatrist. So I want to ask if people are thinking about the psychological backgrounds to why we get into these things, because I listen to people talk about, the socialists and the other ists, and every time I hear an ist at the end of a word, I hear a very authoritarian structure where there's an answer that's there and people have to fit into it. I think any ists are really problematic, and we need to get beyond that. I see things in multiples, that there are different things that go for different parts of human behavior, and we have to deal with humanism, and life, beyond humans, the entire environment we have to see in a very different way. And I'm really interested in what, is it Senor Del Sol? Is that your title, Senor, or what?
Well, I think, Stephen, you'll have to communicate with Stephen in the chat, because he's not one of the speakers. You can't ask a question to him.
I'm just want to make a comment about what he said, because I really believe in direct democracy and moving it to where we can do that. It's a major thing, because then everybody becomes powerful. And the closest example I see to what goes under that way, strangely enough, is the stock market, because every day you can make a different choice, or even during the day, on what you are supporting and not supporting. And there's no reason that we can't do that in our politics, in our decisions about what goes on. And it's not like the whole thing disappears all at once. It changes because there's an evolution of thinking that goes on around it. But we could do that with our politics, instead of having people in there for 2, 4, or 6 years where we don't know what they're thinking.
Okay, Stephen. Right.
That's my thought.
Yeah, indeed.
And I'd be interested in hearing any feedback anybody might have on that.
Okay, lovely. Thank you so much. So I think we'll go in the same order as before. So KJ, John, and Kiran.
I love the question and about direct democracy, and I'm a big believer in direct democracy. And I also have pragmatic reservations in that it doesn't work once you scale up beyond a certain level. And the proof of that pudding is that direct democracy has only been exercised historically in 3 or 4 places on the planet. The first one is in Periclean Athens. That was a long time ago. And it wasn't really, not everybody could vote there. And secondly, currently it is exercised in 2 cantons in Switzerland, in Appenzell and Glarus. Appenzell like the cheese, and Glarus, which doesn't have any cheeses associated with it. And then the third community, which I think exercises direct democracy, are the Zapatista liberated zones. But outside of that, I have not seen direct democracy function at a scale anywhere on the planet. I do think as a partial step towards direct democracy, I think one thing that can be done is what I would refer to as participatory budgeting, that you can pass policy that allows people in cities to budget, because budgets are really what matter. If you can get participatory budgeting inside your locality, I think that could be transformative. That would mean that you don't have cities that spend 50% of their city budgets on the police, as is pretty standard for most US cities and areas. I think also that the Chinese model of whole process democracy, which I can't get into right now, is also worth looking at and considering. Regarding Dr. Ku's question about Burma, I absolutely agree. Sorry, not Burma, but Malaysia. I think it's absolutely important that we also uncover that history and understand it in its fullness, because that is a completely occluded part of modern anti-imperial struggle, even more so than Korea, which is already terribly occluded. The piece that I want to lift up, which Dr. Ku pointed out, is that the British campaign against the Malaysian communists was a campaign, again, of genocide, because the plan was to starve them to death. And this is why the British pioneered the use of herbicides in war in order to kill off all the rice plants, of course, to destroy the cover, but also to kill off all the rice plants and therefore starve them to death. And when the US began its project of spraying Agent Blue and Agent Orange and all those rainbow agents in Vietnam, it was with the same idea as the British. Agent Orange was originally designed to wipe out the rice crop and to starve the NVA and the Viet Cong to death. And it's only, once again, because of the resourcefulness of the NVA and the NLF that they were not successful. The last piece is what Stephen said about psychological issues and isms, etc. I think the most dangerous ism that we need to address, more so than any other of the other quote-unquote political isms, is the ism of individualism. Individualism does not exist in the English language until 1750, and it arises, and it's always predicated with the term economic individualism. Economic individualism is a euphemism for capitalism. The rise of individualism is also the rise of capitalism. And then it creates its obscuring and mystifying ideologies around it, of which psychoanalysis and psychotherapy functions as kind of like a folk religion that inculcates a kind of Protestant fundamentalism that obscures our need for solidarity and connection. And probably the best example of the person who put that ideology forward is Margaret Thatcher, who said, there is no such thing as society, there are only individuals. When you talk about individualism and psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, all of these are focused on the individual. You're actually doing the work of the capitalists and reinforcing it. And understand that capitalism is a predatory system, and the predator needs the prey to individualize, to be atomized, to be fractured, in order to pick them off and to destroy them.
Thanks, KJ. That was great. John, would you please respond to this last set of questions. Oh, and I should say before I go to John, Renee, if you would like to just put your question in the chat, because we won't be able to go to a third round of questions. We should end this soon after. So sorry about that. Go ahead, John.
Yeah. Regarding the Malaya question and why we don't know that much about it, I believe it's because, I mean, we don't know as much about it as we do about what the United States is doing, because British imperialism, which was the big imperialism before World War II, is now a junior partner of US imperialism. And it played that role at the end of the Second World War too, and it repressed revolutions not only in Malaya, but also in Aden, also throughout Africa. It prevented the independence of the countries, and it fought wars. In Greece, it repressed a communist revolution. There's civil war going on, and the British imperialism came in on the side of the right wing and crushed the workers' movement in Greece. So all these went on, and we're not thinking about it too much now, probably because the center of gravity had shifted so heavily to the US in being the center of world imperialism, and that's British imperialism, and Malaya is as important as Aden or Africa or Greece. And we should learn about that as we do about all peoples of the world. Regarding the questions of direct democracy and things like that, you can't have really any kind of direct participation of the masses in democracy if you have private property and private ownership of the means of propaganda, which we still have, whatever the social media, it's still very private, the social media. And this controls how people vote. It distorts a vote, and except in situations, as KJ said, in smaller situations or in a couple of places where there exists some sort of structure for direct democracy, but it's still heavily controlled by not only by the media, but also by the power of the state. The state is in the hands. It's still the way Marx has said it, it's still the way Lenin has said it. The state is in the hand of a ruling class. If that ruling class is a capitalist ruling class, then that state apparatus, that army, along with the media, is going to be turned against the people. And anything they do, if they happen to all vote that they should get a raise and the bosses don't want to give them a raise, it's not going to be that easy to get that raise unless you have a strike. And even then, it won't be easy to get a raise because you might get shot at. And that's what I think we have to think about. If we have a situation where we have eliminated the capitalist state, then you can figure out ways of using the technology to get a more instantaneous or some sort of feeling of mass sentiment with regard to a particular point. But I think that'll have to develop as it develops, not as something that we can say. If we suddenly had a system where everybody could vote by pressing a button on their phone, whether we want to have increase the education budget or decrease it, that may not work out too well. What we might find out is best is that people want to increase the budget or want to decrease it. But even that wouldn't be that sure for me right now. That's it.
Okay, great. Thank you. And finally, we give the last word to Kiran. Please go ahead. Hang on, Kiran, where are you? I have to find you before I can unmute you. Oh, is he not? Has Kiran left?
Hiya. Thank you.
Ah, you are. Very good.
Okay. In terms of the direct democracy question, I completely agree with the previous speakers on what they said. I would just emphasize as well, though, given it's particularly relevant with what we're talking about, I think it's a really good idea to have a look at how these socialist systems that are established now operate and help the masses of the people actually engage democratically in their workplaces, in their local governments, and in their national governments. Because quite often the thing people realize over here when I talk to them about Vietnam is they always start with, you've heard the same types of quotes before, but like it's an authoritarian one-party state, blah, 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 and everyone's repressed and blah, blah, blah. And then you start telling them about how when you stand for election in Vietnam, you all get, it's all a flat line. You can't use your money. You can't go around. Like you all have the same hustings. Yeah, you can't put posters everywhere. There's a certain place where posters get put up and everyone gets a poster. Everyone is equal in that sense. There's the strength of the unions and how they participate in making legislation in the country and how the unions are so big and so strong. You only need to look at women's workers' rights in Vietnam to see how far ahead they are of us. And then when you look at the women's union and the strength it has, you can see why they're so far ahead of us. It's because they have a lot more democracy in how they govern themselves day to day. I would also just repeat kind of like what the previous speaker said as well about the fact that you can't really discuss these kinds of things properly without having a systemic approach to the question, because as was highlighted previously, if we did have some kind of referendum system where we all put forward our goals, we all know what we'd like in our workplaces, right? We want wages that we can actually live off. We want working conditions that don't deprive us of our basic needs. We want to be able to see our families. We want homes that, provide us with shelter and warmth and things like that. We know what everybody wants, but we wouldn't get it under a capitalist system, regardless of what little bits of the system change, because it's not in the interests of the people who govern the system. There's a really good quote by Lê Yun when he analyzes the emancipation of women in society. And he said, the emancipation of women must be associated with the national liberation and the liberation of the working class. If the nation and the working class are not liberated, the women will not be liberated. Yet, if the women are not emancipated and do not share the role of masters of the country, the nation as well as the working class are not really liberated. There's a dialectical relationship between the groups, and it is really important that we look at it in forms of system, not in terms of little things here and there. In terms of the Malayan question, I don't have an awful lot to talk about with that, but I do think it's really important that we analyze how, there is that thread between different colonialisms and how they influenced each other, and then how it influenced how American imperialism worked after. And I do think a lot more study needs to be done on Malaya and what happened there. And then the last one about isms and why you can't evolve your thinking. In terms of evolving thinking, I think Marxism-Leninism does that very well. You only need to look at things like the COVID-19 pandemic and see how well socialist nations coped with that, and how badly and poorly a lot of capitalist nations coped with that. And that's because of their quick thinking, and because Marxism-Leninism allows you to adapt to the current material conditions. But what it does is it forces you to look at those material conditions and use them in your analysis, rather than putting, the economy above and beyond everything else. And then in terms of why there's isms and why there's ists and things like that, again, it's a systemic outlook. You can't look at the current system and the way that it's developed without noticing these patterns and noticing these groups and the interests that they share, and then obviously seeing how past movements like in Vietnam have countered those systems and established their own systems which work better than capitalist systems at similar economic levels. There's loads of studies on that and things like that, but you can see in Vietnam, for example, with massive alleviation of poverty in 1986 to now, the multidimensional poverty rate has gone from 60% to, I think it's 1.93%. You can see that Vietnam is one of the most forward nations in the world for afforestation and green technology. It's the #1 nation in the world in terms of public library rate. It's one of the most talked about countries in the world in terms of the quality of its education system. And you can see that's a direct result of this ism, of this socialism and the communism that they're working towards. Thank you.
That's a wonderful set of points, Kirill. I don't think I can do any better, so I'm just going to leave it at that with your last words. Thank you, everyone, for coming to this webinar. It's really been impressive. I think we've had at the top about 80+ participants, and I think some 50 others were watching on YouTube, which is pretty good for a webinar we just thought of earlier this last week. So thanks again very much. And if you like this webinar, please visit our website at www.internationalmanifesto.org and follow us. Maybe read our manifesto. And yeah, and you will find information about our activities, including very shortly, we will put up the information about the next webinar on 80 years after the defeat of fascism, the role of the Soviet Union in it, and how it is being misconstrued and yeah, how much misinformation is being created about it next Sunday. So you'll find that information there as well. So www.internationalmanifesto.org. So with that, thank you all for coming, and see you at our next webinars. Bye-bye.